So my name's Andy Applebaum. We're going to be talking about applying automated offensive assessments. Just a quick bio. I'm a researcher at MITRE. I work on CALDERA and ATT&CK. I hate talking about myself, but I love playing chess, and I notice there's chess sets out there, so if you want to play chess, please let me know. I love playing chess.
Henry Foster, also at MITRE, a security researcher there, also not a big fan of IOs, so I think we'll just get started.
All right, so a big motivator for this talk is kind of this false negative problem, really the challenge in measuring security. As defenders, we have this problem where we sometimes treat our networks as castles and just focus on the perimeters, and we think if our perimeters are great, then everything's great. And it's not really true, and realistically, as defenders, it's sometimes hard for us to really understand what we're missing. And offensive assessments, never mind the kind of offensive assessments, generally the idea is you want to stress test your network by executing a real attack and seeing what happens. How well do you do? Did you detect the attack? How far did the attack get? And how can you improve your detection? The idea is that by executing a real attack, you say, okay, I don't just have these perimeters and I'm using these checklists. I'm actually executing something and seeing what actually happens if an adversary were to get through to my network. And offensive tests are great. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them in general, but generally they are kind of hard. They cost a lot, from a monetary perspective to run. They require a very significant time investment, both from your red team, your blue team, your pen testing team. Every team, you have to kind of set it up, scope it, lots of time. They're very dependent on the capabilities of the personnel. Different people are going to do different things during an assessment, and so if red teamer A runs something and then red teamer B runs something, you're going to get different perspectives each time. And they're also difficult to repeat sometimes. Unless you have kind of a predefined script or plan or you know exactly what you're going to do, you don't always know, or you can't always repeat it unless you kind of have that all pre-declared beforehand. And then the last one kind of goes off of that, where designing the closer. I don't. But I don't want them to hear me, because if you guys hear me, you're going to judge what I'm saying. Come on. And the last point is just designing the test. It goes back to repeatability. How do you actually design a red team exercise to test what you're looking for? And I didn't mention this, but I love automation. I think automation makes everything better. I want to automate all of the things. And I also believe that automation makes offensive testing easier. First, it lowers the cost to run an exercise. If you deploy some sort of automated offensive testing tool, you just push a button, it goes, it runs its thing, it gives you some results, you're perfect, you're good to go, everything's fantastic. It's less time intensive, you can kind of just play with the GUI, at least with CALDERA, which we'll talk about, to design the actual assessment. It's no longer dependent on personnel necessarily, it is dependent on the underlying technique model for the tool, but it's not dependent on the personnel who are using the tool. You can also repeat tests because they're very well structured. It's all machine readable, very kind of well formed. And then the last one is designs can be saved. That kind of ties into some of the other points. And the community agrees. There's been a very recent push towards more and more automation. We're going to talk about CALDERA, that's MITRE, but you can also, I'm sure you've all heard of like Atomic Red Team from Red Canary, Meta from Uber, Red Team Automation from Endgame, Infection Monkey was one from a couple years ago. And then there's a whole host of things that are kind of related to Bloodhound. First there's Bloodhound itself, and then a few different tools that all kind of use Bloodhound as an input. I see a lot of cameras, so I'm just going to let you all take pictures of this before I move on. There's more out there too, so I apologize if you guys are saying, you aren't listing my favorite tool, like I ran out of space. So this talk is going to talk about a lot of things. Generally, our goal is to talk about how we actually use automation. Our hope is that there are going to be kind of three big takeaways. First is how automated offensive assessments work and how you can use them practically. The second is trade-offs between different assessment methodologies, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit more, but all these different tools, all these different ideas, there's different ways to run an automated offensive assessment test. And then lastly is CALDERA. We're going to talk a lot about CALDERA. We're going to do a live demo, and hopefully that should work, but you never know. We do have a video in case that does fail. And so the outline, I'm going to talk about the range of automated offensive assessments, go over a couple of key use cases. There's a million of them, but I'm going to cover a couple of them. Then we're going to talk about specifics of CALDERA, do a CALDERA demo, and then some kind of assorted closing thoughts. So diving right into it, what really goes into automated offensive testing? And I kind of break this down into three main categories. The first is the core techniques. This is effectively like what the software, what the assessor can actually do. The second is scope, and this is how the assessment is actuated at the technique level. You really have kind of two big buckets. You have something that's like end-to-end, or something that is where the actions are isolated. There's kind of a spectrum there. And the last is how actions are selected. For isolated actions, you don't have as much of a selection question, but if you're doing something end-to-end, how do you dynamically compose techniques in a realistic way that a red team operator would do? And one thing I'm just going to point out, there's tons and tons of overlap between each of these, and kind of, if you choose to do like atomic tests, you don't care about action selection too much, so there is a little bit of I always forget that phrase, codependence between some of these different dimensions. So you've all taken attack stickers, so I'm sure you've all heard of attack. I've been at MITRE for 3 years, and I don't think I've ever given a presentation without talking about attack, so I just have to talk about it. Attack is a free, publicly available knowledge base of adversary behavior. I'm sure you've all seen the attack matrix, but it has the tactics on the top, which are kind of the adversary's goals, and the techniques, which are ways that adversaries achieve those tactical goals. Within attack, we have kind of more of a description, and then we have the specific procedures. These are examples of adversaries and software that execute these techniques. And one of the great things about attack is that it provides a gigantic corpus of all these things that we can do. Here I focused on post-compromise, but the idea is that we have this giant set. These are things that they can do, and these are things that, if we're doing automated offensive assessments, this can be a library of things to go off of. Some key things about attack is that it describes adversary TTPs, not IOCs. It's grounded in real data from cyber incidents, so it's not like theoretical attacks. It's like these are real things that we've seen adversaries do. It decouples the problem of what adversaries are doing from the solution, whatever defensive solution we want to deploy. And this is another great thing about attack, is that a lot of people might say, from a blue team perspective, here's how I want to use attack, but we can also use it from a red team perspective. And then lastly, it transforms thinking by kind of enumerating post-compromise adversary behaviors. So anyway, that's a very quick bit about attack. And in this context, attack is great because it kind of encapsulates all these other different technique profiles. And to talk about some of what those might look like, I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples. The first is something that if you have an automated offensive assessment tool, what is it actually doing, right? And one of the main things that we've seen some of these tools do is kind of just launch exploits. They're very straightforward. They scan for vulnerabilities. If they find a vulnerability, they exploit it. Very simple. The pros of this are that it's very easy to understand, very easy to communicate results. Say, oh, I found a vulnerability and I exploited it and it worked. Or, oh, I scanned for a vulnerability and I didn't find anything. Relatively straightforward. The cons are that it can cause damage, because when you're launching exploits, you can actually cause, things to break. And there aren't a ton of techniques in scope. Going back to the attack matrix, exploits are only a small portion of what adversaries are actually doing during their engagements. Something a little bit bigger is, I'm just going kind of like weakness focused. This is more penetration testing, but it's more advanced than just kind of exploit-driven tests. Here you have exploits and scanning like before, but now you also have like default credential guessing or simple brute force algorithms. Maybe even web-based attacks might be worth throwing in there. The pros are that it's still larger than exploit-driven, and you can also test a lot more common problems. The cons are that you're still really not covering a lot of what adversaries are doing throughout their operations, and there's kind of a pre-compromised focus. And then the other big thing is it's easy to give up with something like this. If you're running something that's weakness-focused or exploit-driven, if there aren't any vulnerabilities found, you're just like, oh, well, I'm done, everything's secure, and that's great. And then the last big category is something behavior-based. I tend towards this model myself just because I love attack. But this is more kind of a red team approach where basically the TTPs are anything that an adversary would do, kind of all the behaviors, anything. And obviously there's kind of a subset that you can use depending on what you're really interested in. The pros are that it's more realistic, that you can have a much larger scope when you're running an assessment. You can identify dependencies between techniques, because adversaries, they tend to compose things together. When you're doing the behavior-based emulation, you're a little bit more in line with that. And it's much more thorough. It's a little bit harder to miss things when you're doing it this way. Having said all that, if you have a behavior-based approach, it's harder to design or implement because so much is potentially in scope. What do you actually want to do and how do you compose things together? How do all these things relate to each other? Then it's also a little bit harder to communicate. I think ATT&CK makes it much easier, but it's a lot less clear than like, hey, we found a vulnerability and we exploited it and we moved on with our lives. It's a lot more like, oh, we did X, Y, and Z, and communicating X, Y, and Z is sometimes a little bit more difficult, depending on who you're talking to. For scope, I think, this is really kind of how the assessment is actuated, how you're actually running the assessment. And there's two big categories, and I think there's a spectrum in between the two. But really, things are isolated actions. This is a paradigm where the assessments are really actuated at the host level. You're just running techniques, usually as one-offs, but you're really just controlling discretely what those actions are. And the other approach is something that's end-to-end. This is where you're going to kind of start your assessment tool with a foothold on the network, and you're going to give it a profile of how to behave, and it'll just go until it either achieves a goal or spreads or kind of propagates through the network. It kind of just goes until it can't go any further. And there's a lot of variation between the two, but generally these are the two big buckets. Now there are advantages and cons to each. For isolated actions, these are very well defined, they're controllable. You say execute A, B, and C. It's very straightforward there. You have lots of options because you only need to say, like, execute these specific techniques. The target tactics, if you go back to the attack matrix, isolated actions are great for trying to do things for persistence, privilege escalation, and defense evasion. Things that are really constrained to that host level. End-to-end assessments are also good. They can identify real attacker paths. You can kind of see what would happen if an adversary were moving through the network. But they also create a lot of interesting artifacts as this is happening, but they are typically a lot more time consuming because so much more is in scope, so much more can happen, the assessment can run longer, so you get to run fewer assessments. They can also miss weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are outside of the path that you're in, where they're not really testing everything as kind of all-encompassing. The target tactics here are privilege escalation, discovery, and lateral movement. The end-to-end assessments really shine in this case. Now, the last big thing as part of an automated offensive test is the action selection strategy. And at kind of the bottom level, you have an atomic selection strategy where you just say, go execute this technique, go execute this technique, go execute this technique. It's very straightforward. There's very little computation. It is low overhead. It's easy to control and formulate a hypothesis, but it will miss dependencies between the actions, and it doesn't really provide a full red team experience where you're chaining things together. Something a little bit more advanced is using a finite state machine. Here you kind of can walk through, like, I'm going to do action A, then B, then C, then D, and jump back to A. And it walks you through kind of that kind of decision-making process. It's good for a variety of scopes. It's fairly low overhead. It's kind of quick to compute something like this, and it works pretty well with smaller models. It'll pick up some dependencies, but not necessarily all of them. But the biggest thing is it lacks complexity and extensibility. If you wanted to train like your blue team operators using a finite state machine approach that's kind of iterating through actions, they're always going to see the same pattern over and over and over again. No variability or changing there. And then the last type is something that's more dynamic. Here, you basically tell the tool, hey, go execute techniques A, B, and C as part of kind of your general scope, and then it figures out how to compose those together to achieve some sort of goal that it's looking for, kind of whatever the purpose of the assessment is. This is great for end-to-end assessments. It'll pick up all your technique dependencies. It's great for large technique models where you want to say, here's 50 techniques, figure out how they go together. But computationally, it's intensive, it can be slow to run. This is a fun research problem. And the other biggest thing is it's hard to explicitly control. It's hard to say, go do X, go do Y, go do Z. It's more like, go do this profile, and then it goes and it does it, and you kind of see what happens. And that's a quick overview of kind of these different components. I'm going to talk a little bit about some use cases. At a high level, this is like a huge oversimplification, but the idea is that, if you want to use automated offensive assessments, for most of them, you're going to install some sort of toolkit or kind of some preparation or some sort of manager for it. You're going to run an assessment, you're going to get the results, and then you're going to use the results, which is very high level, as I said. And there's tons of use cases. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of three down here. The first is network traversal testing, where you try to figure out like what an adversary would do if they were to compromise your network. The second is measuring and validating your defenses, kind of coming up with some concrete metrics to see how secure you might be or how well your defenses are working. And the last big bucket is evaluating defensive tools. How do I onboard something new into my environment? So testing your network, this is more kind of testing your network traversal, but the idea is you want to see what would happen if an adversary were to compromise your network. The idea is you just say, okay, how far would they get? You know, I'm just going to hit run on my assessment tool, see how far it's able to get through my network. Usually, when you're running an assessment like this, you want to measure how many hosts that they would be able to compromise. The idea is to say, okay, I'm going to start with the initial compromise and kind of see how that propagation works out throughout my network. Running it, it's pretty straightforward to install. You set the entire network into scope if you have that option. You run the assessment, and then you kind of record the level of compromise at the end. The best profile here for you to use is really something that's end-to-end, because only end-to-end is going to give you that full traversal path. Something that's behavior-based, so you have more techniques in your model, and something that chooses techniques dynamically to kind of give you those dependencies between your different techniques. A runner-up I just want to mention is also end-to-end, but you can do something weakness-focused that uses a finite state machine. This will also give you some relatively interesting results. It'll be faster, but it won't necessarily be as thorough as something that's behavior-based. The second big one is measuring your defenses. The idea here is you want to both measure and validate that your defenses are working in a way that you kind of expect them to do. It's a very simple idea. You kind of scope the assessment for what part of the network you want to run it. You scope the assessment itself based on what techniques you care about, you know, what techniques are actually going to trigger your defenses or you're actually going to be trying to prevent in your environment. You run the assessment, you get the assessment results. Usually the assessment tool will tell you, hey, these techniques were executed, these techniques worked, these techniques didn't work. You obtain your defensive logs, any alerts you have, any kind of things in your environments that are going to be reflective of artifacts, and then you compare the alerts to the assessment results. How many did you prevent? How many did you detect? You know, how many could you have detected? Did you actually have the data for those? And how many did you respond to? And then the other big one is, you know, if you're doing validation, you're also going to want to check to see whether or not your defenses performed in a way that you expected them to. I'm just going to point out, optionally, you might rather run this in a lab. The idea there would be to kind of stand up a lab infrastructure similar to your real environment, because you don't always want to do this in your production environment. There's lots of different profiles that are good here. Each of them have pros and cons. For end-to-end behavior-based dynamic, kind of that whole, you know, does everything, everything's in scope, it really wants to use initial compromise to end. This is great because it'll pick up dependencies and it'll leverage real attacker paths as it's triggering your defenses and measuring and you're measuring them. But it won't trigger everything because it's really trying to do that end-to-end, more of a traversal-based approach, and it can be slow and time-consuming. Something a little bit weaker, if you have the end-to-end weakness-focused finite state machine approach, this will be much faster. It will also leverage real paths. You can see real dependencies in your network, but it also won't trigger everything. It might stop at a dead end if it can't find anything, and it'll have a smaller set of techniques being tested. So that uses isolated actions, that's behavior-based, that's doing kind of atomic, you know, isolated tests. This is also fast. You can design it if you have a big enough corpus of things to run. You can design it to trigger most of your defenses, but you do need to manually tune some of them and manually run some of the exercises, and the attacks aren't necessarily realistic because there's no real training. Number 3 is evaluating defensive tools. You know, the big question is, how do we actually do that? Usually, it's a manual process. We read the documentation, we consult with experts, we actually, you know, we potentially run live offensive exercises. You know, it's a relatively big process, or it can be. Automation can help. The basic idea is straightforward. You set up a lab environment to in some way mimic your real environment. You seed some sort of valid attack paths. You kind of like weaken the network to make sure the assessment does something. You install the assessment tool, install the defensive tool, run the assessment, and then measure the tool's results. Optionally, what you can do is swap out different defensive tools and compare how they each did. Now, the best profile for kind of measuring defensive tools will depend on what the tool is supposed to do. Something that's doing detection or mitigation, really the best thing there is using isolated actions and atomic tests, because that's going to trigger the most defenses, it'll trigger the most detections, you'll see whether or not the techniques worked. For something that's more like trying to give you context or secondary detection, even analysis of what an intrusion might be, that's actually better to use end-to-end behavior-based and dynamic assessments. Those are going to give you more context as opposed to the atomic tests, which are just going to tell you whether or not something worked. And if you want to do response as another tool to evaluate, again, end-to-end dynamic is great here because really only end-to-end will be disrupted by an active response. I listed 3 use cases. There's probably lots more. These are a few ideas. One of, kind of 2 of them, the first 2 are pointing out that automated offensive assessments have easy structure and you can replicate them, and you can do continuous and flexible testing. The idea is kind of underlying both of these is that you can run many of these assessments, compare your results over time, see how you're improving. If you're not improving, whether or not things are going well, things are going bad, just because you can just push a button and things will go, and everything's well structured because it's all machine readable, things are a lot easier. Training is another big one. I had more slides on that one, and they got cut, unfortunately, but really kind of the 2 big things are that your analysts can see how Reddit actually works and explore how techniques create telemetry data that they can look for, start learning what artifacts I should look for. Then the last big one is just generating new data. There's a bit of a training aspect here too, and you can also try to come up with like label data and to generate analytics. And there's some nuance there because you want to avoid overfitting, but the general idea is to kind of show you what maybe data sources you would be looking for. Now, I think that's going to wrap it up for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Henry to talk a little bit about CALDERA.
All right. Okay, everyone, can you hear me okay? All right, great. So a little context on CALDERA. CALDERA is our MITRE's prototype end-to-end automated assessment tool. Essentially, what we were looking to do is to build a piece of software that acts like a realistic adversary against Windows enterprise environments. In order the adversary behavior that we're modeling, we used ATT&CK as our threat model to inform like what techniques we would try to implement and what kind of behaviors we would try to replicate. And then so in order to get it to work, we actually use some planning AI to tie the different steps together. So every action that we implement has a logical piece that's attached to it. So there's a definition of like what CALDERA needs to know about in order to run a technique, and also like what it will learn or create after it runs the technique. So like at first it doesn't have very many actions available to it, but it will start doing some discovery, like finding out what hosts and users are on the network, looking for credentials, and it'll pull those results back and we'll start parsing them and loading it into its knowledge store. And then as it like learns more about the environment, like more actions unlock, and it's able to go through them all. And another thing is that we try to make it so like once you've implemented one of these steps, like you can mix and match them. So like some have dependencies on the knowledge that comes from other ones, but you could have like multiple implementations of a technique that ran in different ways but generated the same data, and you could swap those out interchangeably. So these are our goals. So these are the things that we're striving for. We're not necessarily like 100% perfect on all of them, but this is like what we're looking to do. So we want it to make it real. We want to like do things that like a real attacker would do, and that'll be better for like the data that we generate with it, and also be better for like defenders who are evaluating this. And we also want to do end-to-end, which Andy talked about a fair amount. So basically, not just like run tests in isolation. Like we want like a realistic like chain of activity. So you actually like CALDERA is like moving through a kill chain as it goes, and like discovering things, stealing credentials, laterally moving, and then repeating that process as it's moving through the network. And then also we want to allow extensibility so that people can add new actions to it, and we can define like new techniques. So this is kind of how it's like all like thrown together. So we have the CALDERA server, and the CALDERA server is basically like a Python web backend. It stores data in a Mongo database. It has the AI planning component, and that's where the logic lives. So that like evaluates like what techniques it can run, evaluates new knowledge as it comes in, and then like suggests new actions that it can do. Also, so on the domain that we're attacking, what we do is we load a Windows service onto that. We call that the CALDERA agent, and so that provides a shim to CALDERA to be able to do stuff on that host. And part of the reason for that design choice is by installing the agent on it, like you are like hard coding like what hosts are possible to be in scope. So like no one wanted to create like a Windows Active Directory worm that would just like get out of hand and like do something bad. Then finally, we have a remote access tool, and basically this is CALDERA's implant. And so that actually starts up independently of the agent, but it's the agent that is ferrying commands between the server and the implant. So if you want to use CALDERA, first thing you do after you've installed the server is you load that agent service onto the host that you want to run an operation against. You create an adversary profile that's basically just clicking which steps or techniques you want it to use. You want to identify like which ones of those hosts that have the agent on them you want it to run against, and then you like launch the operation and sit back and have some coffee and watch it do its thing. So like as CALDERA is operating, it's going to be reporting what it's doing. It's going to take the command output and it'll show it to you in the web interface. And then once it's exhausted all the actions that it can do, at least the actions that it determines will like tell you something new about the network or create something new on the network, it will stop. And then after that, you can, if you want, before you start snapshot everything and then reset it afterwards to kind of rerun it and do it again. But there's also actually a cleanup feature in it where it'll go and try to delete all the artifacts it created during its operation. So you hit like the cleanup button, it cleans up, and then you can just run another operation right afterwards. Cool, and now we can actually see it. Also, let's hope that I appease the demo gods enough, because there are a couple moving pieces to this one. Alright. So this is the CALDERA web interface. And context about this demo, basically I'm running local virtual machines. So I have a tiny Windows domain, so one domain controller, and 3 Windows clients. There's also a Linux server that's basically running CALDERA and some other services. So the 3 kind of main big pieces to running CALDERA operations, we have this threat dropdown, this network dropdown, and this operation dropdown. The network is simply just picking which of the hosts that have the agent installed on them are going to be in the scope. So in this one, I've already created it. I have everything in there. I could like create another one that's just like 2 hosts, and I could remove a couple of those. So when I start like CALDERA, I can tell it to use like either the larger 4-host domain or the smaller 2-host domain. The other main thing is like this threat category. This has our adversary profiles in it. So these are basically bins of where like you decide like what techniques you want each one of these profiles to run. So this is a very simple one. Basically steals credentials with Mimikatz, creates network shares, copies itself over it, and then uses WMI to execute. So what we can do is we can actually show you like editing it, creating a new one. So in here I can like uncheck, steps that I don't want to use this time, or I can recheck it. What I'll do here is I'll add this privilege escalation techniques. This is basically just power up. So I've preloaded like an abusable service onto these demo hosts. So this first one is like used for discovery. So this is like using power up to figure out what's available to abuse. And then this one will actually try to modify the bin path of the service that power up finds. Just hit submit there. We also have this artifact list feature. So in here you can define what CALDERA like names the artifacts it creates. So in this case, when it drops executables, like it'll randomly select one of these. And I need to make sure that I remembered to add that to the profile we'll use. There's only one. So now I'm going to fire it off. So one of the assumptions behind CALDERA is that it's trying to emulate post-compromise activity. And so basically to do that, we give it a freebie implant. We give it like one compromise host for it to start from. And so what we can do is I could manually copy over the rat and I could execute that however I wanted. Like I could, you know, like email it to myself in one of the VMs, like download it and like double click it, like, you know, it would be horrible for anyone to do. But I can also have CALDERA bootstrap that implant and like start automatically using the agent that we have there. So in this case, I'm going to have it start as this user, like just the main user, and that user's password is, you know, basically like just complex enough to meet the default requirements. And that account was pre-created. So right now we see CALDERA starting. So this first thing it ran is PowerView. So use PowerView to figure out all the other hosts in this domain. So found all four. Then they turned blue. Now it's running power up. Yeah, so it was able to escalate privs by modifying the binary path of that bad panda service that I loaded on here earlier. So like full disclosure, like I actually softened the host. That was like people talk about like host hardening. Like I did host softening to try to like maximize like the interestingness of the demo. So like part of that was I actually like enabled plaintext credential caching, so it can't steal like plaintext passwords. And so now it also enumerated administrators groups with these other guys, also using PowerView, which is an awesome tool. And it mounted the network share, and it copied itself over there, and then it executed that file, like its implant that it copied over with WMINE. And it'll keep kind of cycling through this until it like gets to the other two. So while we wait for that, we also have this cool artifacts tab, and so this is keeping a list of what CALDERA is creating as it's doing its work. So, oh no, okay. Well, the adversary profile I tried to set didn't work, so we don't get to have fresh prints CALDERA references on this one, which is a bummer. Yeah. But so what I've also done on these hosts is I've installed Sysmon and hooked it up to an Elasticsearch pipeline. So we can kind of see like if you were right, so a defender could be like running CALDERA and they could have like the results or the events that are created like going into their own login environment, and they can start like looking for what CALDERA did. So right, we just search for like this commander.exe, which is just the default name CALDERA gives its implant. I think I probably forgot to hit submit after I added it to the profile. We can kind of start seeing the things that's doing. So here we see like this process called create, like C /commander.exe. That is basically that WMINE location. So the cool thing about CALDERA is that because it's like an end-to-end tool, like when you're like looking at this information, you can do like more realistic incident analysis. So you can like walk the process tree, like going up to see like what other like interesting thing has happened. You can look, you know, you can notice that there's like a command with net use in there, and then you can go over to that other host, start searching there, like find, you know, basically the implant that started on the other host, and you can start looking for like all the stuff that happened on the other host. So we have like another prototype called Cascade, which kind of tries to like automate some of those pieces. So I'm going to give that a whirl right now. So this is a tool that automates like a lot of the queries that, you know, an incident analyst would do when trying to determine the scope you know, of an incident. And so I'm just going to that's getting data from those Windows hosts. I'm gonna run it. So it's running, so it found the initial implants that were named like commander.exe. And now what it's doing is it's actually like walking up and down the process tree and also looking for like file and registry and network activity related to it. And so if you see like this number of jobs, this progress bar down here, that's actually like, it's making recursive queries against Elasticsearch to pull in these different events. Refresh it. We can start to see things are like kind of taking form. So we have this commander.exe process, right? And it created like all these other processes. So all these other processes. I'll keep going, so I refreshed again. And here, so the cool thing about using this adversary in Caldera is that Cascade was actually able to infer lateral movement. So it was actually able to connect like clusters of activity from different hosts. So for instance, like this file lives on the main controller host, and it has a link back to like this WMI execution, which lives on the workstation 1 host. So like, this is really cool to look at. Like a lot of like these connections like between hosts are based on like parsing command lines, which is brittle. But it does make a really cool demo, and you could conceivably like extend the tool to use other data sources that wouldn't rely on command lines. So in addition to that, we can also go, and now that we've like pulled in a good amount of this activity, we can go and we can run like these preloaded queries in here. And these queries are actually like tagged with attack techniques. So we can just select all of those and we can run them. And I'm running them just against like the events that have already been pulled in. So as these execute, we'll start getting like these bubbles that say that basically these like matched one of those preloaded queries. And at some point, like, the downside of that like nice like force directed event graph view is that like once it gets like too much stuff on it, like it's impossible to read anything. But we can kind of go here and we can look at a summary of what it found. Right there. We can also kind of like look at these different clusters of activity and see, and we can get like some idea of like what kind of behavior was actually going on here, like like discovery, execution, persistence, like at this high like attack pattern level. And then like it'll also just build you a timeline of everything that happened. And if we scroll down, we can see it like staying on workstation 1 and then like moving over to the main controller and workstation 3 and doing stuff on other hosts. And that could be like filtered to just be attack techniques. So going back to Caldera, away from that, it did finish. After it finished, it automatically cleaned up the operation. So like it killed all the implant processes it spawned. It removed all the files. So you can see we have like this commander.exe file on workstation of 1. If I hop back there, right, it's gone. The other kind of cool thing that I want to show really quick, since I think I have time, is this BSF feature. So this is something that we use internally at MITRE for trying to diff Caldera's output with like events found by blue teams. So let's see. Just grab an editor that's horrible with the one to talk about. So basically, this is Caldera making a guess at like what the actual host events that are generated by activity will look like. So this is going to look a lot like Sysmon. So we have timestamps saying that like this process was created between between these two timestamps, we have the command line that the process is executed under. This is actually how we get around like PowerShell execution policy. We also like add like tags to the attack techniques and tactics relevant to that technique there. And so we give over enough events for people to get started and to like see what they found. Like we haven't found a way to like basically expose the whole process hierarchy. Basically we can figure out the PID and the command line of like the first process we kick off, and if that thing like spins off a ton more, like we can't like get that. But they can use like these values to go find that. I think that's all the demo that I was planning to talk about, so I'm going to hop back over to our slide machine. Okay, that's good. For a second I thought like the part of the demo that broke was the actual like PowerPoint presentation, which maybe would be a first for anyone. Actually no, I'm disappointed that didn't happen. Yeah. So like summarizing like CALDERA between like more like isolated atomic tests, like I definitely think that there is a huge place for both. Where atomic tests like really shine is that they can be executed. Well, they have no dependency on other techniques, and they can be run exhaustively. So, like CALDERA, like has dependencies. So if you stop CALDERA early on in its kill chain, it won't run everything. And then if you've selected multiple techniques that would have the same effect, right? So if you're like dropping a file, and you have like two different ways of dropping a file, like once CALDERA uses one of those ways to drop that file, like it won't use the other way because it knows it already dropped it. And I'm using the term like knows, like super loosely. So like. Artificial intelligence people don't care. But there's other trade-offs, like so atomic testing. You can fire them off, like check against like all the defenses in your environment, validate that they're working as expected. Also, they're like really easy to like add new ones. Like basically, you just like write the command lines and like bundle up the files that you need to execute them. Like. Creating new steps or techniques in CALDERA is fairly time-consuming, and the reason for that is you need to write the logic, so the pre and post conditions, like the requirements and effects, for each one of those things. Like once you get the hang of that, that goes fairly smoothly. Assuming that you're doing something that CALDERA already does. If you want to add a more novel kind of technique, you sometimes need to change the data model that's under the hood. Inside of there, and figuring out how to do that can get trickier. Also, when we run commands, we need a way to bring the output of that command back into CALDERA's knowledge base. So now you need to write a parser, basically to pull out the right fields and load it into the right kind of object that we have in our database. Or maybe you just want to create a new tool and not use something else. So you don't necessarily need to write a parser, but now you're writing a tool, which is probably going to work. And then also, for some instances, you may need to do more sweeping changes. So if you wanted to, so something we want to do that CALDERA doesn't currently do is kind of asynchronously bring back knowledge. So for instance, if you were operating on a host where credential guard was turned on and you couldn't steal credentials just straight out of memory, but you can't intercept them as they go into memory. So it would be great if we could have CALDERA spin off a process that would basically just listen for and intercept those credentials and then asynchronously shove that knowledge with the new credential intercepted back in the database, and then CALDERA would evaluate and be oh cool, now I know credentials, I've unlocked new actions that I can do. And then also, for instance, if you wanted to use different injection techniques or something, currently we don't have that, so that's basically giving the implant the ability to now execute things in different ways. Right. But where I think Caldera really shines is when you're trying to, evaluate or develop tooling that's used more for overall analysis, less for like finding specific alerts. So you'll find an alert, and there's usually like not enough information just there to decide whether it's like truly malicious or just a false positive. And even if it is enough to decide it's a false positive, or decide that it's truly malicious, you still want to like know the full scope of what occurred around it. So that's something that Caldera can help you like practice and to see if your tools can do it. So for instance, like if you see something like try to prevest, you're like, and you get an alert about that, and you know like, oh, this triggered because something tried to prevest. Okay, like that's cool. What else did it try to do? And then the other big one is if you want it to like fully exercise its killer chain, like you may need kind of an unhardened environment. So like I mentioned, I did like host softening on the target domain for this demo. Like you can change that by implementing more steps. So as like new behaviors become available to Caldera, like you don't need to, soften the host as much because it has other avenues to go through. But like I said, creating the new techniques is unfortunately time consuming, and while we're like trying to figure out ways to like make it easier, we haven't like come up with the silver bullet that makes it super simple. Okay, so I think we have officially 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna probably mostly skip this slide. If folks want to take a photo of it, I'll leave it up for a few minutes. My favorite use case is for like data generation for tool development, right? So if I'm like working on a tool to try to like maybe like automate some like blue team activity or see something, I don't need to like manually go and like try to like move around the network or do bad things on the network. Like I can focus on like what I'm trying to develop, and I can run like Caldera in the background and click a button and it'll generate data. Also, right, you can also experiment with like adding different like logging stuff in your environments. So like run it, with sysmon installed, like see what you can find. Then like turn on like PowerShell logging, like run it again, like see like the extra value that turning on that additional logging gives you. All right. So what's next for us? So we're actually planning a large update to our GitHub repo. The priorities are we have a new logic language, which will like make it a little bit easier to write new steps. Also like an enhanced data model that supports the new language. So now it's like going to be easier to also extend the data model that Caldera uses. And then also like much needed stability and usability improvements. Like there are like some pretty glaring bugs in there right now that like people run into when they're trying to use it. So that's something we definitely need to iron out, and it's like at the top of my list. We also plan to just be like way more active on GitHub. We released this tool about a year ago, and we kind of like left it out there. And now we're starting to figure out like how we can basically shift most of our development to GitHub. So that's like our plan going forward. And we're definitely, if you want to get involved and like start like implementing new behaviors or playing with it, like definitely like encourage you to do that, and feel free to reach out to us for that. We also built a Slack channel, so we don't have like automatic invites set up yet, but if you want to like shoot us an email or something, we can add you to that.
I'm just going to really say, automation is not a silver bullet. It's hard. It's never really going to replace the ingenuity of a human operator. So, the big thing with automation is that it's going to make it easier for your operators to do other stuff. And until I'm done, so I'm going to show you a bunch of links. I'm Andy, that's Henry, we've got emails. Cascade is open source. Go download it, play with it, have fun. Caldera is open source, have fun. We got documentation. We've also got papers too if you want to read them. And if you have any questions, feel free to time for any questions. He says no time for questions, but you can find us. We can do questions out there. So thank you.